On February 24, 2022, Russian troops invade the Ukraine. The narrative from the governments and the mainstream media in the West is that the invasion is totally unprovoked. There is a lot of speculation. Is Putin sound of mind? What is he trying to accomplish? Is he trying to retake old Soviet Union states? But the narrative stays constant. From the White House, this is a fact sheet 1 year after the invasion. It says, brutal and unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. To the government of Canada, this is off of their website from a joint declaration, unprovoked and unjustified invasion. To the UK government, this is a response, unprovoked and premeditated war against the Ukraine. From the BBC, Russia's bloody unprovoked war. To the CBC in Canada, Russia's unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. From Fox News in the States, brutal and unprovoked assault on the Ukraine. To CNN, Russia's unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. Unprovoked, unprovoked, unprovoked. So I, like most people who have done some reading on the conflicts of the last 70 years, am very skeptical of war and the narratives about it given to the people of the West. So after doing some reading on this war, I found out that there are actions that the West and NATO have done that can be considered provocative towards Russia involving the Ukraine. In this video, I'm going to show and explain a few of these actions, and everything will be sourced from reputable sources that you can and hopefully will look up yourself. When I talk about the fact that the West might have provoked some of Russia's actions, people get very uncomfortable and call me a Putin sympathizer. So I'm going to do my disclaimer right off the start. I don't like Vladimir Putin. I think he is a murderous, tyrannical dictator. He absolutely should not have sent his troops across an international border into a sovereign nation. The blood shed by the escalation of this war starting in February of 22 is on his hands. But the idea he woke up one morning out of the blue, had his eggs, and sent his troops into the Ukraine isn't true. There is a long history with Russia, Ukraine, and the West that the media is not talking about. I know in this day and age that people like to think in black and white narratives on a lot of issues, including this war, but once you do some reading into things, you will find the world is a very gray place. I want to point out that the things I talk about in this video are not the whole narrative. These geopolitical issues are extremely complicated, especially involving war. I just want to point out a few things that contradict the idea that this war was completely unprovoked. I want you to look at this from the lens of, if this happened to you, would you consider these things a provocation if another hostile country did this to yours? Because I really believe that before people decide if they are supporters of a conflict, they should know all sides to the story. So this video is going to have 3 quick parts. NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, expanding a defensive network to protect ourselves from whom, spheres of influence, how the world should work compared to how it does work, and Western influence in the Ukraine, wandering into Russia's sphere of influence. And just to reiterate before we get started, I am not standing up or sympathizing with Putin. I am just saying that there is more to this story than is being led on. NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, expanding a defensive network to protect ourselves from whom. So our story starts in 1990. This is what Europe looked like. The red is the Soviet Union and the states that they controlled, and the blue are the NATO countries. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The reason why it was created was to get Western countries together into a military alliance to deter the Soviet Union from expanding more than it had at the end of World War II. On their website, they define themselves as a defensive alliance whose members are committed to safeguarding the freedom and security of each other against all threats from all directions. Deterrence and defense is one of NATO's core tasks. Allies are significantly strengthening the deterrence and defense of the alliance as the backbone to their Article 5 commitment to defend each other. Article 5 states that if one country in NATO gets attacked, it is considered an attack on all of them. In 1990, the Soviet Union was becoming unstable. The West was negotiating with the Soviets on the reunification of East and West Germany, tearing down the Berlin Wall. During these negotiations, James Baker, Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, made the famous "not 1 inch eastward" statement. He said if the Soviets allowed reunification, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward past Germany. So this is the first source material. I will number each sourced article and I will post a link below so you can read it yourself. I hope that you do. This is an article from the National Security Archive. It is ran out of George Washington University and it archives declassified government documents. This article speaks of the assurances Baker, George H.W. Bush, and other leaders and diplomats made promising no further eastern expansion of NATO to the Soviets. The actual memos and meeting minutes are archived so you can read on exactly what was said. An excerpt from this article says, Not once but 3 times Baker tried out the not 1 inch eastward formula with Gorbachev on the February 9, 1990 meeting. He agreed to Gorbachev's statement in response to the assurances that NATO expansion is unacceptable. Baker assured Gorbachev that neither the President nor I intend to extract any unilateral advantages from the processes that are taking place, and that the Americans understood that not only for the Soviet Union but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastward direction. At the end of negotiations, guarantees of NATO's expansion were not written into the treaty that reunified Germany. But most scholars believe that the Soviet Union were verbally led to believe that NATO wouldn't expand. These guarantees are referenced in the future by Soviet and Russian leaders, including Putin himself. And when it comes to NATO expansion, you could ask, why would it? Because in 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapses. The great enemy of the West and the reason for NATO's existence was no more. Many countries in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia gained independence. Russia, as we know it today, was formed, and the United States was left the world's only superpower. The NATO alliance had no major military threat worldwide. One could ask, what purpose would NATO expansion serve at this point? Growing NATO would certainly make the countries in it feel safer, but could strain relations and alienate the countries that it did not include. Remember, this is a military alliance. But fast forward to 1999, the first round of NATO expansion begins, seeing Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary join. In 2004, the next round commenced, adding Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic countries Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, 2 of which are directly on Russia's border. In 2009, Albania and Croatia join. And from then until the present day, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Finland. So this is what NATO looked like in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is what it looks like now. After each round of expansion, Russia increasingly expressed its concern of NATO's moving farther and farther east, often quoting the assurances given in the negotiations regarding Germany in 1990. A few examples of this opposition are, firstly, in a CNN article from 1997, Russian President Boris Yeltsin will not attend a NATO summit in Madrid next month because he disapproves of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. The article goes on to say Yeltsin has strongly opposed the expansion effort, saying it threatens Russia's national security. Secondly, Putin talks about NATO expansion in a 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference. He says, "It turns out that NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, and we strictly fulfill the treaty obligations and do not react to these actions at all. I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have our right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them, but I will allow myself to remind the audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of NATO General Secretary Mr. Warner in Brussels on May 17th of 1990. He said at the time that the fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. Where are these guarantees? So the excerpt of this speech lays out pretty clearly that Russia sees NATO's eastern expansion as a direct provocation towards them. So let's remind ourselves of what we are doing here. I am pointing out examples that contradict the media and government narratives that this war is totally unprovoked. Russia expressed multiple times during NATO expansion as them seeing this as a direct provocation. So the idea of NATO expansion splits people into 2 camps. Camp 1 would say, why in the world would you expand a military alliance towards Russia? It will only strain relations with them. In the 1990s, Russia was greatly weakened after the Soviet Union fell, and they were not a significant threat to the sovereignty of the countries allowed to join NATO. Ted Galen Carpenter wrote a scathing article titled "Many Predicted NATO's Expansion Would Lead to War. Those Warnings Were Ignored," just after the Russian forces invaded in 2022. In this article, he outlines numerous people in positions of significant power in the U.S. who made this point. He quotes Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State. She said even the first stage of NATO expansion provoked Russian opposition and anger. She said Yeltsin and his countrymen were strongly opposed to the enlargement, seeing it as a strategy for exploiting their vulnerability and moving Europe's dividing line to the east, leaving them isolated. He quotes Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State. He similarly described the Russian attitude, saying many Russians see NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, inherently directed at their country. They point out that they have disbanded the Warsaw Pact, their military alliance, and they ask why the West should not do the same. It was an excellent question that neither the Clinton administration nor its successors provided even a remotely convincing answer. He quotes George Kennan, the intellectual father of America's containment policy during the Cold War, who perceptively warned about what the Senate's ratification of NATO's first round of expansion would set in motion. I think it's the beginning of a new Cold War, Kennan stated. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There is no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. Kennan ended that New York Times article that Galen Carpenter is quoting here by saying something along the lines of, "This has been my life's work, and it pains me to see it screwed up so greatly at the end." Galen Carpenter also quotes Robert M. Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense under George W. and Obama. He stated his belief that the relationship with Russia had been badly mismanaged after George H.W. left office in '93. Among other missteps, the U.S. agreements with Romanian and Bulgarian governments to rotate troops through the bases in those countries was a needless provocation. In an implicit rebuke to the younger Bush, Gates asserted that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. That move, he contended, was a case of recklessly ignoring what the Russians considered their own vital national security interests. So these people all fall under Camp 1. They say, why would you expand NATO towards Russia? It will do more harm than good. And then there's Camp 2, people who say that NATO has an open-door policy, and countries are allowed to join if they choose, if they meet the criteria to do so. Who is to stop them? That leads us into part 2 of the video, Spheres of Influence, how the world should work compared to how it does work. A sphere of influence, by definition, is the claim by a state to exclusive or predominant control over a foreign area or territory. The term may refer to a political claim to exclusive control, which other nations may or may not recognize as a matter of fact. Or it may refer to a legal agreement by which another state or states pledge themselves to refrain from interference in this sphere of influence. So what that means is that powerful nations will claim the countries around them to be in their sphere of influence, and they will not allow foreign intervention or influence in those countries. At the same time, the nation claiming the sphere of influence will often intervene themselves. For an example in the West, let's take the United States and the Monroe Doctrine. It lays out what America sees as its sphere of influence. It has 4 basic points. It says, the United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. The United States recognized and would not interfere with the existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization, and any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act towards the United States. So what that is saying is if any foreign country comes and tries to intervene or influence any country in North, Central, or South America, you are looking for war with the United States. Teddy Roosevelt expanded upon the Monroe Doctrine, saying that in cases of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American country, the United States could intervene in that country's internal affairs. And interfere they did. I'm not going to get into it in this video, but if you're looking for some light reading on a rainy day, read about the United States intervention with the governments in Central and South America. There is a lot there. But I don't bring this up to single out the states specifically. I bring it up as an example of this is how the world works. Countries near to large powers are often subject to the influence of these large powers, whether they like it or not. So much as the States has their sphere, Russia considers itself to have one too. The problem lies with the fact that the Ukraine is in it. Russia wants to have the dominant influence in this country for a few reasons. Putin considers the Ukrainian people to be ethnically Russian, and Ukraine is important to Russia's national security. Russia has been invaded many times throughout the years through the Ukraine, the last being World War II, in which the Soviet Union suffered somewhere in the area of 27 million casualties, roughly 1/8 of the total population. It is of extreme importance for them not to lose total influence in this region. At this point, I should talk about the people of the Ukraine and how they play into this. The majority, but not all people, are in favor of their country expanding its relationship with the West and not Russia. And it is a tragedy that the people of the country can't decide for themselves who they want to align themselves with in the world. This is how the world should work, but sadly it's not how it does. Putin does not care about what the people of the Ukraine want. He cares about Russian interests regarding the Ukraine. People have asked me, shouldn't we morally want to help the people of the Ukraine fight for their independence? But that is a totally different question that I'm not getting anywhere near in this video. The question of should we be supporting wars to help nations that fall into other spheres of influence gain independence is a whole different can of worms that everybody has a different opinion on. The point of this video is to show examples of provocation by the West towards Russia, not debate whether those provocations are justified or not. This idea of Ukraine and Russia's sphere of influence ties back to NATO. In 2008, there are talks about Ukraine and Georgia joining the alliance. This leads us to the famous Niet means Niet cable. This is a private message sent from William J. Burns, an ambassador in Moscow, back to the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, as well as others in the United States. The title was Niet means Niet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. It said in summary, following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan at the Bucharest summit, Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neurologic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even some claim civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Additionally, the government of Russia and experts continue to claim that Ukrainian NATO membership would have a major impact on Russia's defense industry, Russia-Ukrainian family connections, and bilateral relations generally. In Georgia, the government of Russia fears continued instability and provocative acts in the separatist regions. End summary. Another excerpt of this cable, titled Russian Opposition Neurologic and Concrete, states, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried with the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. So what this is saying in simple terms is that Ukraine joining NATO is Russia's line in the sand. It has seen NATO expand closer and closer, but it will not put up with the Ukraine's admittance to the alliance. It sees it as a potential military threat and it will warrant a response. This message was sent to the US on February 1st, 2008, so it kind of proves the government knew this at this time. But 2 months later, coming into the Bucharest NATO summit starting on April 2nd, George W. backs Ukraine and Georgia for NATO membership. George Bush this morning said he strongly supported Ukraine's attempt to join NATO and warned he would not allow Russia to veto its membership bid. Speaking in Kiev after a meeting with Ukraine's President Viktor Yushchenko, the U.S. President says both post-Soviet Ukraine and Georgia should be allowed to join the alliance despite vehement objections from Russia. In remarks likely to infuriate the Kremlin, Bush said that Ukraine should be invited during this week's NATO summit in Bucharest to join NATO's membership action program to prelude a full membership. At the NATO summit starting April 2nd, the United States pushes for the admittance of Ukraine and Georgia, but is opposed by European countries, namely Germany and France. Admittance was not granted, but a statement was made that the Ukraine and Georgia would be allowed to join in the future, but no date was provided. Once again, Russia finds this as a big provocation. To summarize this part of the video, Russia considers Ukraine to be in its sphere of influence and will see NATO admittance as a military threat as outlined in the Niet means Niet cable. Just as the United States would not tolerate foreign influence in their sphere, Russia will only tolerate so much in the Ukraine. And as we have seen, if the West tries to spread its influence too much in this country, it will eventually trigger a response. In Russia's eyes, this country is on their border and crucial to their national security. Losing total influence in the Ukraine, which is what would happen if NATO granted admittance to it, cannot happen. It is important to keep this in mind as we move into the final part of this video about Western influence in the Ukraine. Also, it is important to remember as we go along the point of this video. Our governments and media are telling us that Russia invaded the Ukraine with zero provocation from anyone. No one is talking about NATO expansion and the concern Russia has been sharing about this since the mid-90s. No one is talking about how Russia sees the Ukraine as in their sphere of influence and how important the country is to them. And no one is talking about what we're going to get into next. So that gets us into Western influence in the Ukraine, wandering into Russia's sphere of influence. This last part of the video starts in 2013 with the Euromaidan. The Euromaidan was a wave of protest across the Ukraine from November 2013 to February 2014. Started after President Viktor Yanukovych backed out of the European Union Ukrainian Association Agreement. This agreement would have strengthened economic ties between the Ukraine and Europe. Yanukovych instead pursued an economic agreement with Russia. The protests grew throughout the Ukraine as people rallied against not only the change in economic ties, but widespread corruption and abuses of power in the Yanukovych government. The Revolution of Dignity, or the Maidan Revolution, was the culmination of the Euromaidan, protests from February 18th to 23rd, 2014, which ended in the ousting of Yanukovych from power and the installation of a new government. Over 100 Ukrainian protests were killed by state police during the protest, and this led to the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. The Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity could be a video in itself. I'm just going over it briefly to summarize. The people of the Ukraine, for a number of reasons, revolted and removed their pro-Russian government. In December of 2013, while the Euromaidan protests are happening, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs Victoria Nuland makes a speech to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. She says, since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine. So, in a time of political turmoil against Ukraine's pro-Russian government, she openly says that the U.S. has been sending billions of dollars to the Ukraine to help support anti-Russian government. It doesn't seem overly important, but this is the West sending money to help build government more friendly towards them. This is spreading influence in Ukraine. This is certainly provocative towards Russia. On February 7th of 2014, a private phone call between Victoria and Jeff Pyatt, who is the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, is leaked. And I just want to point out that this is printed by the BBC, a worldwide respected news source. In the transcript of the call, they are shown talking about what should happen with Arseny Yatsenyuk, leader of the People's Front Party, Vitaly Klitschko, leader of the Ukrainian parliamentary election, and Oleh Tyahnybok, leader of the Svoboda Party. These three parties came together to form the next government after Yanukovych was ousted, with Yats becoming the prime minister. They say things like, I don't think Klitsch should go into government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. And I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. What he needs is Klitsch and Tyahnybok on the outside. So this article is dated February 7th, 2014, 11 days before the Revolution of Dignity and the ousting of Yanukovych. In other words, two high-level U.S. diplomats are caught talking about who's going to run the pro-Western government in the Ukraine before the pro-Russian government is even ousted. Russia sees this as a provocation. The end of the Revolution of Dignity begins the Russo-Ukrainian War, a civil war in the Ukraine between the pro-Western government and the Russian-backed separatist regions in the east. Putin invading the Ukraine was technically an escalation of this conflict, but it has been fought since 2014. Before his invasion, there had been 15,000 casualties already, and during the conflict, the West and NATO openly provided financial aid, military aid, and training to the Ukrainian army. So firstly, we'll talk about training. This is an article from the NATO website titled NATO Military Staff Welcomes Ukrainian Cadets. On the NATO website, they openly say, for the last 25 years, NATO has been committed to its partnership with the Ukraine, providing training, support to defense reforms, and encouraging interoperability. In an article from the BBC, they talk about the U.S. Army base training Ukrainian fighters. They're talking about Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. It has proved a valuable training ground for dozens of Ukrainian soldiers over the past several decades. More than 8,000 international officers have trained at the base in Kansas, including some of Ukraine's top generals. Ukrainian officers started coming to Fort Leavenworth in the early 1990s. Back then, they studied alongside Russian officers, But then in 1999, the Russians stopped showing up. About the same time, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. As for who pays for this, about half of the people there are funded by their home government. The other half are supported by grants provided by the U.S. State Department to foreign governments. In September of 21, this is before the invasion, Ukraine holds military drills with the U.S. forces and NATO allies. This article goes on to say, Ukraine began joint military exercises with the U.S. and other NATO troops on Monday, at a time when neighboring Russia and Belarus have been holding large-scale drills that alarmed the West. Ukraine, at war with the Russian-backed separatists since 2014, has long sought closer integration with Western militaries in the hope of one day joining NATO. So the NATO countries in the West have been training and doing exercises with the Ukrainian military for years. This can all be seen as provocation towards Russia. In 2016, the U.S. activates Romanian missile defense site, angering Russia. In a Reuters article, they say the United States switched on an $800 million missile shield in Romania on Thursday that it sees vital to defend itself and Europe from so-called rogue states. In the article, they name Iran as one. But the Kremlin says it's aimed at blunting its own nuclear arsenal. The Kremlin also worries that this missile defense system could be used offensively. In an article on foreignpolicy.com, Putin's fixation with old-school U.S. missile launcher. Russia says the Pentagon's European missile defense isn't so defensive after all. Does it have a point? In this article, it says that the Mk-41 launchers inside the missile defense batteries could be adapted to fire Tomahawks. The United States says they have no plans on doing this, but they could. This is a bit of an emotional issue for Russia, seeing as it's in Romania, which was a state in the Soviet Union. Russia voices its opposition to this and sees it as a provocation. Another missile defense site in Poland was planned to be operational by 2022. I think that has been pushed to 2023, but this is also in another post-Soviet state, an emotional issue for Russia. And then in the period from the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War until Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the West backs the Ukraine financially, starting with non-lethal aid. On March 4, 2014, roughly 1 week after the Revolution of Dignity and the swearing in of the new Ukrainian government, the U.S. sends the Ukraine a $1 billion loan. In this article from ABC News, it says that Secretary of State John Kerry traveled to the Ukraine today to show support for the country's new government amid mounting tension from Russia, and he showed up with a pretty big gift too. Kerry brought news of a $1 billion aid package the U.S. is giving the Ukraine to help it get through the next few months of turmoil, according to the U.S. Treasury Department. The aid is made up of a $1 billion loan guarantee. And then from 2014 until the invasion, U.S. gives the Ukraine another $1.2 billion in non-lethal and starting in 2018 lethal assistance. In an article from ABC News titled "Trump Seeks to Rewrite His Role Bolstering Ukraine, NATO," it says that Trump in 2018 had approved the $47 million sale of 210 Javelin anti-tank missiles and 37 launchers to the Ukraine, the first military assistance provided to the Ukraine by the U.S. in its fight against the Russian-supported separatists since fighting began in 2014. And lastly, Donald Trump was impeached the first time for withholding military aid to the Ukraine until they investigated Joe and Hunter Biden's business dealings with the country. This was coming into the 2020 election. This military aid was worth around $400 million, and this was all prior to Russia's invasion of the country in 2022. I do just want to add that it wasn't just the United States that was training and funding the Ukraine. Lots of other countries in the West were doing it as well. I just picked a few stories here in the sake of time. So to conclude this section, the Ukraine was never granted admittance to NATO, but the West treated it like a NATO country. It trained the Ukrainian army. It sent the Ukraine billions of dollars, including lethal aid, to fight against the Russian-backed separatists until Russia invaded in 2022. To take this video as a whole, the West expanded NATO further and further east until it was on Ukraine's border. Russia voiced concerns about this that were largely ignored. The importance of Ukraine to Russia was discussed in the 2008 Niet Means Niet cable, and the Russian position on Ukraine joining NATO was clearly outlined. But the West continued to send billions of dollars to the Ukraine in lethal and non-lethal aid and trained its army to fight against Russia. And our governments and media to this day push the narrative that this war fell out of the sky. Putin one day set out on a warpath for no discernible reason whatsoever. To that, I would say, are you kidding me? For 30 years we have been provoking Russia. They are leaving out huge parts of history here and selling us a war on false pretenses. So I hope you'll read some of the sources and articles in full and look into this thing a little bit deeper, because you're not going to get the whole story from your president, prime minister, or your favorite mainstream media news source. On February